This is Conservation and Science Podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and I always strive to bring you diverse perspectives on every environmental story that I cover. And what that means is that sometimes I talk with people who might be on the opposing ends of environmental debate. And the reason I'm doing this is because we need more dialogue and understanding and less division and fighting, not only in environmental stories, but in life in general. But in this podcast, we're concerned with environmental stories. So, in other words, I try to make you to listen to people you might have not listened to otherwise. And today we are taking on the topic of offshore wind or offshore wind farms. And this topic, like a lot of environmental topics, has divides opinions. Some people say this is the best thing ever. We need wind farms in a transition to help us in a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And what the better place than the open ocean? We have a lot of wind there. That wind blows unobstructed by landscape features and by some buildings maybe. And also look at all that space. We can spare land for agriculture or for wildlife. So this is the best thing. But on the other hand, people who are opposing those wind farms, offshore wind farms, are saying, well, we shouldn't really be industrializing seas. And the arguments revolve mainly about the unknown impacts on the wildlife, on the marine wildlife, once those wind farms operate, but also on much better known impacts on the marine wildlife, cetaceans, specifically marine mammals, while those constructions are being built. Being the pylons being hammered, there's like a massive noise pollution that can, injure or kill sometimes cetaceans, dolphins and whales and porpoises and so on. So today we are taking head on this topic, and our guest is marine biologist Dr. Stephen Comerford, who is ORE Marine Biodiversity Officer at Irish Whales and Dolphin Group. And Stephen worked with oil and gas industry as well as offshore renewables as a person who was responsible for mitigating the negative impacts. He has a vast experience and now works with charity Irish Whales and Dolphin Group, overseeing development of those things and being responsible for the policy around offshore renewables. So he's seen the good, the bad, the ugly. And I'm going to dive today with Stephen into the good, the bad, the ugly. So at the end of this episode, you will have a better understanding of what is really going on, what are the mitigations that are possible, or whether it's going to happen or not, and a lot of other information around development of those offshore wind farms around Ireland specifically. So at least you will be better informed of what's going on, and you will hear that information based on what is actually happening, not based on who screams the loudest on social media. So I hope that if you're interested in offshore renewables, or maybe you're concerned about development of offshore renewables, after listening to this episode, you will have better views, and that episode will help you to, basically refine your views on this topic. That's it for this introduction. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephen Comerford. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Tommy.
It's a pleasure to have you, and this is the second time someone from Irish Whales and Dolphin Group is on the podcast, so I am delighted to have you on.
Very good. We met at the All-Ireland Mammal Conference, did we not, in Galway? Yes.
Exactly. And mammal includes marine mammals.
Yes, it does.
That's why we're here today. Listen, I just want to start with a little bit of a background. You're whale watching. You're observing whales off the Irish coast for many, many years. What was your most memorable encounter?
Memorable encounter. Well, there was one standout encounter. We were out on the Celtic Mist more than 10 years ago. There were a bunch of us there, colleagues and friends, and some international students, and we were out on the shelf edge on the Porcupine Bank. So we were some distance offshore. And it was the middle of the day. We'd had a hugely successful trip so far. We saw so many species. And we were relaxed, knocked out. The boat was drifting. And there were fin whale blows all around us. And we were enjoying that and watching the whales, and there were dolphins everywhere. And next thing, very big blows. And fin whales have very big blows. They're the second biggest mammal, second biggest whale. And so they are very big animals. And we were thinking, wouldn't it be great if we saw a blue whale? And then this whale came alongside the boat, and it was a slightly different color. We all went, oh, and then big blow, and then it fluked, and it showed its tail. And fin whales don't do that, but blue whales do. So positive identification. 2 blue whales. We were absolutely blown away. I'd never seen one before. I haven't seen one since. Rare encounters in Irish waters because they're very far offshore. And also, it's easy to mix them up with fin whales or sei whales for that matter. So if you're just looking at blows, there's no way you could say, oh, that was a blue whale. But the whale was right alongside the boat. We saw the fluke, we saw the color, we saw a second one. And then to add to it even more, an aircraft flew over us, and it was the Air Corps on fisheries patrol. And they called us up on the radio. And they said, who are you? What are you up to? Kind of thing. And so we had a chat. And I said, there are 2 blue whales in front of the boat. And they said, oh, great, we'll try and get photos. And they got an absolutely classic photograph of 2 blue whales in line, one behind the other, from the aircraft. Beautiful photograph. And they also got a really good photograph of the Celtic mist. And the skipper, Niall McAllister, was up on the top of the mast at the time spotting. And it was just fabulous. It was perhaps the best trip ever.
Lovely. Fantastic. Yes. I'm not, definitely that's something that anyone remembers, because those rare encounters are something that tends to stick in our memory. Listen, Stephen, we're going to talk about serious stuff, though. It's all nice, but we're going to talk about the offshore renewable energy. And, you have an experience worldwide working with the industry. And tell me, were there any surprising ways that you learn about marine mammals, how they interact with these offshore renewable infrastructure?
Well, that's very much part of what I do. In fact, my role is now specifically to deal with the interaction between whales and dolphins and offshore renewables. So, yeah, there are many ways in which offshore renewables, wind farms can interact with whales and dolphins. Some of them negative, some of them neutral, perhaps some of them positive. The biggest issue for us, and the biggest issue for everyone, is underwater noise. And as you're probably aware, whales and dolphins, porpoises, are extremely sensitive to noise. And underwater noise travels very far, it propagates in a completely different way to the way it does in air. So a lot of the sort of characteristics of noise that we understand as humans, that doesn't represent what goes on underwater. And whales and dolphins are acoustic animals. They live in an acoustic world. They live in a dark world. A lot of the information they get is through sound. So it's very important. It's as important, perhaps, as sight is to us. It's a very crude analogy. But, they get a great deal of the information they need, to communicate and to hunt and to forage and so on. It's very important. It's central to their very existence. And the construction of wind farms can be done in a number of ways, but the most usual way to do it, and the way that it is proposed to the first tranche of wind farms in Irish waters, is with piling. So piling is where you get a steel pile, which is essentially just a steel tube, and you knock it into the ground with a hammer like a nail. It's a simple and a very understandable analogy, perhaps, but these piles are absolutely huge. And they're proposing piles now that are 10 meters diameter. They're massive. So what happens is the pile is placed on the seabed by a piling vessel, which is a heavy lift vessel. and then they drop a big hydraulic hammer onto the top of the pile, and then they knock it in with this hydraulic hammer. So it's incredibly noisy. The amount of it insolidifies just huge areas of the sea, and that's the pinch point for us. That's the dangerous part. And if you think of the rollout of offshore renewables in Ireland, specifically the first phase, what are known as the phase 1 projects, there are 6 of them, 5 in the Irish Sea, 1 off Connemara, Scourge. That really isn't of so much concern because they intend to gravity foundations, so there's no piling associated with that. So they have a whole new different set of problems for themselves and technical challenges, but underwater noise isn't going to be as big an issue. So if we sort of narrow our focus down onto the 5 projects in the Irish Sea, 4 of them have sent in their planning applications to ORE Planola, and as part of those planning applications, they submit environmental impact assessment reports, which are these absolutely mammoth documents that attempt to capture all elements of the marine environment and birds, and the landfall, all of the interactions, and also some of the social interactions as well, and with transport and so on. But it's an environmental assessment. So from these, we learn that there are going to be X number of piles and X number of, these are proposed, shall we say. These are applications. They propose, say, for argument's sake, 50, on average, 50 turbines per site, and that's 5 sites, 250 turbines. These are very rough numbers. And there are a lot of subtleties to that, but for the sake of outlining it, so each piling event can go on for hours, and each piling event has the ability to, at absolute worst case scenario, actually injure whales and dolphins and porpoises. That can cause acoustic trauma. That's at very short ranges, and there's no need to overstate that, I think, but more importantly, the area of disturbance is huge. And we have a more recent focus on porpoises recently. The Observe, I'm going off on tangents here, but the Observe report has just been published, digital aerial surveys all around Irish waters, recently published, and it paints a pretty grim picture for porpoises compared with the last Observe report. That they look to be essentially gone from the Celtic Sea. And what would have been a very healthy population of porpoises in the Irish Sea has reduced to quite a concentrated small population in the north. So the indications are bad for porpoises. And I think, to circle back, they are particularly vulnerable to underwater noise, and they're also particularly vulnerable to displacement. Because porpoises, as you may know, they're the smallest of our cetaceans. They're very small. And like all small organisms, they need to feed constantly. The analogy is that they're the marine equivalent of a shrew. So, they need to feed all the time. So they're cryptic animals. They have high site fidelity. So, a porpoise has its patch, or a group of porpoises have their patch. They feed there, they live there. They're secure there. And if they're displaced from that, there are effects. There are effects perhaps that we up to now have underestimated. And that it's not a question of, well, if it's too noisy here, that they can go there. It's not as simple as that. And, these decline in porpoise numbers, and it's reflected in more than just the Observe reports as well, but, reports on the SACs, the Rockabill to Talkie SAC, for instance, in the Irish Sea, as showed, the surveying by National Parks and Wildlife has shown a decrease in porpoise numbers. If we go around the corner, it's not just an Irish Sea problem. I live in West Kerry, so I actually overlook the Blasket Sound. The Blasket Islands are there. It's designated an SAC for harbour porpoises. And I haven't seen a porpoise for years. So something's happening. They're under pressure. So our concern is the piling in the Irish Sea. It's a very specific concern. But fortunately, it's a problem that can be solved. The technology exists to greatly reduce the amount of noise that goes out into the water column from a piling event. We can use devices. Bubble curtains are one, and it's a very simple device to understand. It's a tube laid on the seabed, and the tube goes up to a vessel that has a compressor or multiple compressors on board, and it pumps high pressure air into this tube, and the tube is full of holes, and bubbles rise up. And the bubbles had this almost magical property of preventing the sound from propagating out from the piling event. Happy days. So you can put a bubble curtain around the pile. It will greatly reduce the amount of sound that goes out into the marine environment. If you put another one outside that again, you further reduce. This is proven technology. They use it in Europe. They use it in the States. It works. But, of course, there's always a but. It doesn't work as well in deeper waters. And some of the Irish projects are going to be in deeper waters. Deeper as in 40 meters, 50 meters. I'm not talking about 150 meters. So even within the depths that you can use monopiles, the effectiveness of the bubble curtain reduces with that depth. Also, and this is intuitive to understand, if it's a high current regime, the bubbles get taken away by the current. So instead of a bubble curtain, you can imagine like putting a tube over the piling event. Suddenly it's all skewed to one side or skewed to the other by the current. So they become less effective. So it's not, but there are other methods. There are also other methods with great promise. So a lot of the sort of source reduction methods actually reduce the noise the hammer makes, or actually uses something other than a hammer. There's one called blue piling, which is a hammer. And it's very clever. It uses all hammers are hydraulic, but this uses a body of water to slow down the impact and spread. It's that high rise time is the problem with noise. So it spreads out the impact. It actually increases the efficacy of the actual piling as well. And it greatly reduces the noise. So you've got another technology which can be brought to bear, which is less depth or current regime dependent as well. So that's all good. So there's great optimism about these technologies. There are others. You can use a system called vibropiling. So that vibrates the whole pile. It literally makes its way down into the substrate. So there's promise there. There's a jetting technology, which they've been using this year. I think Ørsted put 3 piles in using a jetting technology this year. And the noise it produced was barely above background noise. The ships were nearly as noisy, that were in the area were nearly as noisy as the piling event. So that's just hugely encouraging. And that this technology is being developed. Now, obviously, jetting, any of these are dependent on the substrate. I think that obviously they chose the substrate was kind to them in the Ørsted case, I'm sure. I'm not an engineer. But there are presumably are types of ground that wouldn't work. There's also drilling. You can actually drill a pile in as well. So these all exist. And then to go back out to devices that prevent the sound that is generated from propagating, there are cofferdams and resonators and sleeves that can be used. So the technology exists. But of course, there is another but. It's very expensive. So the developers are, in the Irish case, so they're putting in their environmental impact assessment reports, and they have to do something called a marine mammal mitigation plan as part of that. So they survey the mammals and they try and build a picture of what marine mammals are likely to be there and how many, the densities. And, that's very woolly science, and that's not easy. It's not easy to do. You need a lot of data. And even if you do have a lot of data and say, this is the population density and we're very confident that this is what it is, pick a number. But, maybe they're not going to be there on the day. Maybe there'll be twice as many on the day. They're mobile animals, and we know a bit about what they do and where they go, but not that much. So our focus has always been on mitigate for the sound. Perhaps don't waste too much energy on trying to work out how many porpoises there are per square kilometre. Is it really that important? Yes, of course it's important, but it's not as important as what you bring to bear to reduce the amount of noise.
That was my question. How likely any of those technologies going to be used? Because and I understand this is all in the planning phase, but it's kind of like a repeated scenario that we have all those wonderful technologies, but in the meantime, let's do it quick and let's do it cheap and let's just pile on those. So how does that side of it looks like? Is there any lobbying going on to use those technologies, or what are the chances that we actually see them being used in those projects?
I think the chances are good, and I think that the lobbying is very much is part of my job. We have good working relationships with the developers. They are open to these conversations. They're not. I've worked in essentially two offshore industries. I've worked for oil and gas on the seismic side, and I've worked for offshore renewables on the piling side, all to do with mitigating for noise and working at sea and trying to prevent that interaction. And culturally, the offshore renewable energy industry is way ahead of the oil and gas industry. They are far more concerned about the environment. Top down, bottom up, they have a completely different focus. I mean, and I don't say this in a disparaging way, they are still engineers. They have a job to do and they take an engineering approach to it, which is correct, of course it is. But they are far more concerned about the environment and far more, they seek solutions to these problems. And obviously they do are these technologies to reduce the sound, the noise abatement systems, they wouldn't even exist. So, and the other thing is you've got a strong regulatory structure that originated in Germany and has spread across the European countries that are building out offshore renewables. And they are a long way ahead of us, both in terms of their approach to it and also to what they've actually built. I mean, we've got a few turbines on the Arklow Bank. Not all of them work from many years ago. But, what we're looking at is a very ambitious build-out. And let me say, I'll go off on another tangent here. Let me just say, we really do need to build offshore wind. The biggest driver for marine biodiversity loss is ultimately climate change. And offshore wind is a really important tool in our fight against climate change. We are, of course, we're getting into this very late. And there's a certain sort of feeling in Ireland that we're taking a very haphazard approach to this. I don't believe that's true. I think we're taking quite a pragmatic approach to it. You might be aware that there are two strands to the build-out of ORE, the so-called phase ones, which I've described. And they're under the old developer-led system, under which the developer or multiple developers come and say, I want to put a wind farm there. And they start to do the work, do the surveys, survey the ground, survey the mammals, the birds, and so on, build a picture, look at the geology, look at access to shore, all of these. It's incredibly complex. These are huge projects. So they do this, and then they apply for planning permission for it. So that's the old system, the developer-led system. That is gone. So these 6 projects, the phase ones, will go through this process. I imagine they won't all get permitted. It's expected that there will be some, attrition along the way. But I'm speaking in a broad sense, not about specific projects by any means. But there's a process to be gone through. It's a very difficult process, and it's a process that's brand new to all of us in this country. So it's difficult in every sense. It's difficult for the developers. It's difficult for government. It's difficult for the NGOs. It's difficult for Umpar Planola, all the agencies. There are difficulties around experience and having experienced personnel, having enough of them, training people up, bringing what needs to be brought to bear. We've got tiny marine departments within our bigger departments. They're very small. They are growing, and we're starting to react and respond, but we're starting from a very, very low base. So this is difficult. It's a difficult process. So, but as part of this process, and we have these ambitions, 5 gigawatts by 2030, which is never going to happen. 2033, maybe. There are a lot of bottlenecks, and we are learning as we go. But so we have the phase ones, as I've said, under the developer-led system. And then after that, we're switching to a DMAP system, which is a plan-led, stake-led system. And as you may be aware, they've designated the first Irish DMAP off the South Coast DMAP. And Department of Environment Tech led that process, and they brought a lot to bear. And I think DEC are very much leading this. They're everywhere. They're very positive for focus. They're moving forward in a way perhaps that nobody else is, but DEC are. So they designated this DMAP. It's a complex process to designate it, but we're so pleased. It's environment first. It's a mapping exercise, and mapping is all about layers of information. And the first layers in are the environmental layers. So it's a process. You add all the layers, and then you look at what you've got, and you rule out certain areas and go, we're not going to put anything here. We're not going to put anything here. This is going to work. We're not going to put a wind farm in the mouth of, Cork Harbour. There are lots of things. There are a lot of restrictions. So it's a process, it's an iterative process, and then they remove, and they see what's left, and they say, okay, well, where's the best place? So they designate a broad area, which is the South Coast DMAP, and then within that, they have designated 4 specific areas within which then a developer may bid to build a wind farm. So in some way, the power has been taken out of the developer or away from the developer and moved back to the state. So, and again, it pleases us that the environment comes in at the first layer. So it's a much better process. It's a better process for the environment. It's a better process in terms of certainty, I think, for the developers. We had a ridiculous Klondike situation in Ireland under the old developer-led system, where every man and his dog that could raise a couple of million was out there shooting surveys to essentially try and lay claim to a piece of ground that they could then say, then it could apply to build a wind farm on the basis that they'd worked on, their track record and so on. So it was very speculative. So there were guys out there shooting surveys day and night, everywhere. And the foreshore license application, it was under the old foreshore license system. If you looked at the map, there were these surveys all around the country. It was a sort of madness. And then, the Irish civilians are looking at these maps. They don't really understand the process. How could they? It's a complex process. And people ran off with the idea that each of these was going to be a wind farm, that the wind farms are going to be literally on top of each other. And the whole coast was going to be surrounded by turbines. And it was going to be an environmental and a social disaster. So clearly, someone had lost control of the messaging. And it's unfortunately very difficult to turn that ship. So because a lot of communities on the coast and people are really concerned about offshore wind, and they are correct to be concerned, because these are massive infrastructural projects. We are industrializing the sea. That's the truth. That is what we're doing. But its effect, I think, is overstated. People worry about it perhaps too much. And also its scale is overstated. I think there's a problem with scale. Some people think that they're just going to be, if they're going to open the window in the morning and there's going to be a wind farm outside. It's a sort of an abstract thing, if you like. And then on the other end of the scale, the other end of the misunderstanding scale, I think, is people don't really realize how big these things are. When you stand on a piling vessel, I've been on a piling vessel that had 270 crew, 270 on that vessel. That was in the German sector of the North Sea. And we were surrounded by other vessels that were involved, and barges bringing piles. And this is a heavy lift vessel capable of lifting 10,000 tons. And we're putting in what they call jackets. So shoot off in another one. There's monopiles, but there are also jackets, and a jacket is more suitable for deeper water. And you drop a steel frame to the bottom, and then you pin it with piles, and they are called pin piles. Those tend to be of a smaller diameter than the big monopiles. So, it's a different approach. Tends to be taken for substations and for deeper water. More piles, 3 or 4 per jacket, but smaller diameter, so less noise per pile. Anyway, that was that tangent. What was I talking about? Jackets. Yes, we were up in the North Sea, And you look around and you go, just look at the scale of this. Look at the number of vessels. Look at the size of the machinery. Look at these huge structures we're putting into the water. They're massive. And when they swing the hammer over and start to lower down, everyone's running for earplugs. There are earplugs inside your ear defenders. It's loud. And that's in air. And it's a lot louder underwater, and effectively louder underwater. So just to say that people don't really understand the scale. They tend to overestimate how many of them there are going to be, but they underestimate how big the individual ones are, if you like. So yeah. But this, it sounds it's a harsh term that we will industrialize our marine space. It sounds not like something an NGO would support, but it is something that an NGO supports. This NGO certainly, and across the NGOs, there's people who work with and are concerned for the environment, regardless whether it's a single species or a species group or type, or they're all aware of the pressures that come from climate change and the way that's going to increase, and that we have to do something about it. We have to, more than something, we have to do a lot about it.
This is a question that I have in my mind. Like you said, on the surface, you wouldn't imagine that the NGO would support in quote unquote industrialization of the sea, but then climate change and the effects of climate change are devastating to the environment as well. How do you navigate those contradictions? Because I would imagine that your role is difficult in that way, that you have these two contradicting objectives, let's say. How you deal with that, you personally or you as an organization?
Yeah, it's something we think about and we talk about. And someone came up with a phrase recently, and they were in turn quoting somebody else, saying that offshore renewables is where the climate crisis meets the biodiversity crisis. And I heard that and I was nodded wisely and I went, oh yeah, it's true. And then I thought about it a bit more afterwards and I went, yes, it is true. There is an intersection there. But let's not get the wrong idea that it's a zero-sum game, that it's one or the other. And I think it's very important not to overstate the pressures on marine biodiversity from the build-out of offshore wind. It is also very important not to understate them. We need to bring a knowledge-based scientific approach to this. We need to always be looking to the published literature, to what work has been done in other jurisdictions, other approaches, and do the very best we can. Because in the end of the day, we're going to build those wind farms because we have to. And there was a huge energy and impetus that came from, the Greens in the last government. They did massive work. Eamon Ryan is going to be missed. There was huge energy brought to it and momentum. And these are big projects and it will roll on. That momentum will continue. But, I think we can give Eamon Ryan a great deal of credit for it. And for what he brought to Department of Environment, to DEC, and the work that those guys do. So the intersection between biodiversity and climate, not a zero-sum game. And we have to be both cautious but pragmatic. And, you say about how do you individually reconcile that, or how do we do it as an organization? It's all about information. It's about understanding, and it's about science. It's all about both the science, the data, and the interpretation of that, correct interpretation of that, and doing the best we can. And in terms of personally, I was talking about this recently. When I broaden my view to a global view, climate, we're hearing these terrible predictions. No, it's woolly data, and all the scientists admit that, but potential slowdown or stopping of the AMOC current, the Gulf Stream as it's known, this is be absolutely devastating. Not just to Ireland. We say, oh, we'd have the same climate as Newfoundland. It'd be a disaster. That's yeah, that would be a disaster. But I mean, we're talking about radically changing every ecosystem on the planet. Like the monsoons wouldn't come to India if that happened. There are all sorts of things. These are huge. So when I spread my view out and I look at what we have done to the planet in a very short space of time, and I look at the just brutal biodiversity loss and all this constant rise in temperature, all these potential tipping points, maybe we were already reaching them. And I look at that and I go, this is a disaster. And it is. I mean, face it, it is. And it is extremely depressing that the oil and gas industry, continue to lobby, even COP over in Baku. The oil and gas lobby is there. They're intrinsic. They're well funded. They're well organized. They're very plausible. It's all about money, short term. And they've got massive investment in this. And if they don't keep the thing going, they fall off a cliff financially. They are remarkably slow to move into renewables, with some exceptions, considering that they're so rich and they have so much technological expertise, particularly in the marine. Anyway, that's upsetting and depressing. That continues, and they have the ear of governments all around the world. So we know what that is. So then I get upset and depressed because it's upsetting and depressing. And then I tend to narrow my focus in again. And I go, well, what are we doing here? What are we going to do? What am I going to do? And I'm in the, I would say, fortunate position because of my job to be perhaps able to make a difference directly. That's fantastic. I mean, I'm delighted with my job. That I'm in a position where I can make submissions, which I do, to onboard Planola on the planning applications and go, we must talk about noise abatement, we must build it into, the approach, the technology exists, the developer have to accept the expense, and so on. And that's a very narrow focus. People say, oh, you're doing a response to environmental impact assessment from a phase 1 project. The assessments are huge, they come in a pallet. The printed out, they're massive, thousands and thousands of pages. But I don't read, people say, how do you find the time to read them? I say, I don't. I just go boom, boom, boom into the remember stuff, and then boom, boom, boom to the underwater noise bit. And really, if you consider that it takes teams of consultants, I mean, a lot of people, in a consultancy, usually in the UK, it takes them years to produce this. And I'm supposed to review it in 2 months. I'm not going to. I'm just going to hone in. But that narrow focus, that bringing your focus in from that very broad, oh God, this is very bad, into a piece of work that you can do is sort of what gets me through. And the feeling that we are in some way affected. People listen to us. We have a good relationship with Wind Energy Ireland, a very good relationship with Wind Energy Ireland. We did a webinar recently about underwater noise, which was brought about by Wind Energy Ireland to start this conversation. And they represent the developers. We're in an unfortunate position in Ireland at the moment, where there's a guidance document produced by National Parks and Wildlife, last one in 2014, which it's a guidance document for how to manage underwater noise. They are guidelines. It's not law, but they are guidelines. And people coming in to do a seismic survey or a high-res survey or piling or blasting or soil removal, they refer to these guidelines and they make their plan. But unfortunately, the guidelines are very out of date. 2014, they don't do a piling in a very meaningful way. They mention noise abatement, and things have moved on in the 10 years since they were published. And also the types of surveys. The guidance document was very much based around 3D seismic surveys, which are oil and gas surveys. They're very loud. These massive air guns. That's how I started out in the industry. Was mitigating for those, and all of the sort of thinking, the mindset is based around mitigating for 3D seismic, and then that sort of similar stuff was applied and we'll take the same approach. That's very out of date now. And everyone's aware of that. So the National Parks and Wildlife have committed to reviewing those guidelines. And as far as I understand it, what I've heard is that that process will begin in Q2 of next year. Now, it would have been great if it was done 2 years ago, and that the developers would then have had the certainty of a proper framework in which to make their applications. So they've found themselves in a sort of a guidance vacuum. So they've been plucking stuff willy-nilly from other jurisdictions, mostly UK jurisdictions. And I suppose that's not surprising because most of the consultancies are from the UK. And that's the system they're familiar with. And also, I want to state this for the record, they apply UK guidance thinking and methodology to these applications. It is the cheapest. It is the least precautionary. It does not include noise abatement.
Oh,
So you can see where they come from. You would have some sympathy. You can see there's a sort of a small opening to save 50 million, 70 million per project. It's a lot of money. You can see why they'd want to save it. I mean, imagine their shareholders are somewhat interested in them saving this per project. So there's a lot at stake here. But at the same time, the overwhelming evidence is coming. You cannot pile in the North Sea, in the Dutch sector, Belgian sector, or the German sector, without applying noise abatement. There are strict limits on how much noise you can make. There's a hydrophone in the water at 750 meter from your event, and listening in real time and integrating the noise that comes and measuring it and comparing it to a number of other parameters for cumulative noise and peak noise, but most importantly, I think, for cumulative noise. And there are hard limits. And if you hit those limits, you stop. Intense, directed, accurate litigation. And I worked in the German North Sea. And I can tell you there's considerable tension in the room where you're sitting in front of the computer screens watching the cumulative noise go up.
just go up.
I don't know. That particular operation, I don't know what it costs per day. Certainly more than half of, could have been €1 million a day sort of operation. Any delay is just bonkers. So there's a lot at stake. But it can be done. And what we need now is the National Parks and Wildlife to look at this, to open the books on it, if you like. And we will be involved in that process. We'll be making submissions, and perhaps there'll be a working group put together. I sincerely hope so. Wind Energy Ireland will be involved. The developers will be involved. Academics would be involved. Underwater acoustics is really complex. It's physics. I'm not a physicist. Can't even say it. Not a physicist. I'm not an acoustician. I read about this stuff. I understand the broad concepts. But when you actually get down to it, it's very complex. So there's a very important role for academia in that. And again, it's evidence-based. We're looking at the actual science. We're looking at received levels for animals, what that means. Is it important? Or isn't it? We need to make realistic assessments. There's some criticism of the German system. It's too simplistic. It implies a step change. Conceptually, it says any mammal present that receives X noise level will suffer X injury, and any animal outside that will not. Clearly, that's a massive simplification of the natural world, this step. So there's move towards dose response curves and an understanding that not all animals will respond in the same way. And some of that comes from industry and from consultancy who are interested in reducing conservatism, essentially, in these assessments, to say it's not actually that bad. And maybe there's some truth in that. But when you use a dose response model rather than a step change model, what you find is there are a great deal more animals in the far field that are subject to disturbance. than perhaps had been originally assessed. So, and then if we circle back to the harbour porpoises and our increasing understanding of their vulnerability to disturbance. So I think it becomes insupportable that you would not choose noise abatement. And just finally, perhaps on the noise abatement piece, the UK is now looking at noise abatement. They became an outlier. They were the only jurisdiction that didn't always apply it, or didn't ever apply it. So, and they've built a lot of wind farms. They've built a lot of wind farms in the Irish Sea, and sound travels, as we know. But they are now looking at it seriously. It's starting to appear in documents, and I've heard that they're going to start insisting on it for new applications. We'll wait and see, but really, let Ireland not then become the outlier.
Yeah, well, that's the point. That's the point. Stephen, you mentioned response of the animals, and so I want to switch gears a little bit and say, like, once those structures are already built, right? We pass the build phase. Once they're built, how do they respond and adapt to them? These structures being there.
It's hard to say because then you start to come down to the species that we have in Ireland. I mean, it's not entirely unique, and it is comparable with other places. But we have more baleen whales perhaps than they have on the UK side. Over in the North Sea, they've porpoises and not much else. Whereas here we've got 26 species of cetaceans recorded. Now, a lot of those are deep water species. They're not animals you're going to find in the Irish Sea. So I think there are a number of different elements to how a dolphin or a whale or a porpoise that's swimming around the Irish Sea will respond to these structures. From the noise side, they continue to make a noise. I mean, as they generate electricity, there are a lot of moving parts, there are gearboxes and so on, and there's a low-level noise. It's a low-frequency, constant noise, and it gets noisier as it gets windier. It's intuitive. But at the same time, the sea gets noisier as it gets windier. So there's that. So we're not worried or concerned about the operational noise for fixed bottom turbines. It's not a concern for the Whale Dolphin Group. If it's very windy and the thing is very noisy, it's continuous noise. It's not impulsive noise, and that's important. Impulsive noise, yourself. You're sitting working and some hilarious person comes up behind you and goes, there's a startle response. And also that high rise time is more likely to damage your hearing than a continuous noise. So I suppose you give, the animals have more agency with a continuous noise. They're swimming along and they go, let's have that. Then perhaps they could swim off somewhere else. But there are, of course, other effects to having structures in the sea. So if you take the Irish Sea, say in an area that's flat, been very heavily fished for generations. It's flat. It doesn't have any three-dimensional structures, essentially. And it doesn't have a lot of growth on it. And then you put a big steel tube into it. All these organisms settle on it and start to grow. Mussels would be a good example. Sponges, all sorts of things. So it kicks off a little ecosystem, a unique ecosystem on this three-dimensional structure. And, this is stuff that's well understood for the oil and gas industry. They've had subsea structures for generations. So there is an argument, on the surface of that, you say, well, that's fantastic. We've got a new surface for marine creatures to grow and thrive. And people correctly make the point, yeah, but they're not the same creatures that would be there on muddy ground. They're new ones. No, they're not they're not invasive species. So I suppose there is potential to that. But, but they're not the ones that would naturally be there. My answer to that, it's not a natural environment out there. We have been modifying it, heavily since man first threw a line in off the shore and realized he could catch a fish. Since he went out and knocked a winkle off the rock and ate it. We have been modified. There isn't a square, I would say. It's an exaggeration to say there isn't a square inch of the planet that hasn't been modified, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's heavily modified.
It's like,
anyway.
it's like these novel ecosystems. I think it was episode 184 when we were talking about the novel ecosystems. It's kind of like in that vein, something new is appearing there. And I heard on one of the conferences that the seals tend to be finding good feeding grounds between those structures, because naturally fish tends to congregate around underwater structures, as I'm sure every angler listening to this podcast know. And so seals tends to aggregate more around them and as well. So listen, tell me, like, is there a role for citizen science or citizen scientists to be engaged in this sort of, in monitoring marine wildlife around those farms, or in, any way of influencing the decisions, like you said, for example, to use the noise mitigation practices, anything like so? In other words, like you mentioned that when, how you deal with that, and what I'm taking very naturally from that is that you have a sense of agency over what's going on, and sense of agency always helps to deal with whatever that is. So that's my question about the citizen science. Is there any agency that citizens who are concerned can have, and what they can do?
Well, I mean, yes. The answer is yes. Join an NGO, get involved. It's an obvious thing for me to say. There's
Irish Whales and Dolphin Group.
Well, you could pick the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group as a representative NGO in the marine space. There aren't
link in the description. Link in the description. Show.
Yeah, exactly.
Folks.
And the main NGOs in the marine sector: the Whale Dolphin Group, Birdwatch, Irish Wildlife Trust, and SWAN, and Coastwatch. Excuse me. Sorry, Karen. And we all do what we do. The Irish Whale Dolphin Group is a primary data holder, and a great deal of that data comes from citizen science. It has power. Data has power. Information. Every game is a game of information. If you have information, what can you say? If you have no information, what can you say? You can't say anything. All you're talking about your emotions and your opinions, but your opinions aren't based on anything. So it's all about information. So the Irish Whale Dolphin Group has maintained a sightings database back to 2005. It's robust. It's good data. It's validated data. You ring up Whale Dolphin Group and said, I'm sure it's a pilot whale. I saw a pilot whale. And then hang up. We don't go, oh yeah, this guy saw a pilot whale, and that goes in as a pilot whale record. No, you will be quizzed, and we'll get to the bottom of whether it was a pilot whale or not.
I just had recorded an episode with a gentleman who used to work as a forest ranger in the UK, and he was talking about the records, like people were sending records. What did they see in the forest? And among other, lions, panthers, usual stuff, there was a Jabberwocky also. And he said, like, yeah, and that is the record that we have that someone saw, and they even drew a picture. So you don't do that. You're just hey, can you tell me exactly about this sea monster that you...
The Kraken. We saw the Kraken.
The Kraken.
So Bork Cooley manages the sightings and the sighting database and all that validation. I think you've had Bork on this show.
Yes.
Bork is very, very effective. And he weeds out, or if necessary, downgrades. You might go from, it's definitely winky whale to, we're just going to put it in as whale species because we're not sure. Now that, of course, biases the data set, if you like, to, it perhaps shrinks it to some extent. But it is important that the data is accurate. Otherwise, what's it for? But then again, when you step outside that and say, well, what is it for? It's a record of the presence of an animal or a group of animals in a place on a day. But if you extend that out to the Irish EEZ, which is huge, you cannot generate a density estimate for anywhere on the basis of data that was collected without recorded effort. So if you stand on a headland, or you're in an aircraft, or you're in a boat, and you are recording whale or dolphin sightings, You do that as part of a very carefully designed process that will result in strong statistics and a measure of uncertainty so that you can generate density estimates. They use distance sampling. There's all these various techniques you can bring to bear, but it's all based on your effort. So what was recorded is your effort. You were in a boat, you were traveling at 12 knots. You were in an aircraft, you were traveling at 150 knots. You were an hour on a headland, you were 2 hours on a headland. So you're at the unit of time becomes the unit of effort. And then you look at the area and you can generate your statistics from that. So citizen science is very important, but it is presence-only data. It's not presence-absence data. You can't say there was no whale there the day before. No, you weren't there the day before. So that's very important to draw the distinction, but it must be said, it still has considerable power because, apart from it, because nobody else has it. We have a record for an animal there on that day. If we didn't have that record, nobody would know. So then when you map it, and then we look at thousands and thousands of records, and you map them and you go, oh, look. Well, obviously you're going to have clusters where you've got clusters of volunteers and citizen scientists putting in their observations.
But you can deal statistically with that as well.
You can. It's complex. You use this thing called ensemble modeling. There's a student at ATU who works very closely with the Dolphin Group, Miguel, just finishing up his PhD now, and he used really good modeling techniques. So he took the database, specifically broadbacks, and then he did habitat modeling, and he was able to make inference from it. It's really impressive that you can do it, because there's sort of an old-fashioned notion that, there's no effort associated, we can't do anything with it. Turns out you can. And statistics are more and more sophisticated. Modeling is more sophisticated. And you can tease the information out, because the information is in there, but it's just to tease it out in a way that you can present it and it's plausible and you can stand over it. So Miguel did that. So it has power. That's their Dolphin Group pitch for the sightings. We also operate a stranding scheme. So we've got a data set of both live and dead stranded animals all around the country. That's also important. Back to the porpoises in the Irish Sea, the trend is up.
Okay, good. That's good news.
The trend is up. There are more dead porpoises on the beach over time. It's hard data. It's there. We have it.
So that's a good news.
Well,
right?
It's good news from a statistical point of view. It's good news.
We have a good news, folks. More dead porpoises.
You heard it here. Yeah. So, but it shows the power of the data and its citizen science. Somebody, an Irish Whale Dolphin Group member or not, is walking on the beach with their dog or driving on a road, and they look out, they go, what's that? And they go over and have a look, and they say, well, it's a dead dolphin. I don't know what it is. What do you do when you find a dead dolphin? And then, maybe make a call, and they end up talking to staff or somebody in the office, the strandings officer. They're asked to take a photograph, to send it in. Suddenly we've got data.
That's a good point to mention. Like, I actually made a video a couple years ago now. It might be, the website might have changed, but I made a video, which is on my YouTube channel, how to record a stranding on your website. And, and I done it as an example because I found a dolphin, and it's like, okay, so folks, this is what you do. So anyone who is interested, you can go to my YouTube channel. That video is there, and just record a stranding. And you don't have to be a member of Irish Whales and Dolphin Group.
And there's an app. There's now an app.
There's an app. Like I said, that video is a couple years old, so probably things change. They are even easier than they used to be. Stephen, if you could implement one policy change tomorrow for better protecting marine mammals, marine life around those offshore wind farms, what that would be?
Noise abatement. Simple as that. That you define an acceptable level of noise, and then you bring the technology to bear to stay below that level or at that level. That's it.
So it's not. So that policy, like you said, we still lagging in that regard.
We're not there yet, and I am confident. There's momentum now, and people are becoming more aware of it. They're aware of it as a problem. They are aware of the solutions to the problem. And we try and maintain our profile with the government departments. We do some work with DEC. We do some work with National Parks and Wildlife. We try and keep those channels open and to keep the message coming. And over time, I'm built, expertise is an exaggeration. I did say I'm neither a physicist nor an acoustician, but my understanding of the underwater noise piece and the science behind it is improving over time. My ability to perhaps, directly lobby, because we're an NGO and we do lobby. But we're lobbying based on science. We're not lobbying based on emotion or opinion. It's actual science.
Folks, if you're enjoying this episode, remember to subscribe to my newsletter. The link is also in the description of the show, along with the other links. Go in there and you will get much more content, not only notifications about the new episodes of the podcast. Stephen, to wrap this up, if you look at into your crystal ball, how do you see the future of oceans, of seas, and what role in this the offshore wind and renewables are playing?
The seas they're under pressure. Along with the rest of the planet, the seas are under pressure, and perhaps it's under pressure in ways that are more difficult to predict. Tipping points perhaps will have more profound effects as well. There is a new focus to the marine, particularly in Ireland. I was at a Marine Institute conference on ocean knowledge 2030 just yesterday and the day before, or yes, no. And there is this, not a renewed, it's a new focus on the sea. And a lot of that is coming from the necessity to build offshore wind farms. Suddenly we have to look at this. We have to engage with this in a way we didn't have to before. It was sort of abstract, with the exception of perhaps of fisheries. So, that was a very live thing. A live issue, managed by a common fisheries policy, the industry very involved in that, various state agencies, but only fishing, really. But now we've got ORE to examine, think about, to work out how we're going to do it, but also the interaction between ORE and everything else. Fisheries will be the primary example. So suddenly everyone's attention is on this now, and that can only be good. This concept of sea blindness, people talk about it in this country. We're an island nation, but we're sea blind. It's true, you're aware of that. Of course you are. But things are changing because our focus is now, it is being pulled offshore because we've this work to do. So we need to catch up. We need to catch up in terms of students, taking courses. It's going to be a big industry. And not only the industrial side of it, but also the ecology that underpins the planning decisions, all this to it. We're going to need young people to move into that space to become expert. It's very important. So it starts there. It starts even in secondary schools, primary schools, getting kids interested in this stuff. And it moves on up. And then into the state agencies, the government departments, government itself, awareness. And more resources being brought to bear. We're, as I said at the beginning, we're starting from quite a low base in terms of that engagement with the marine, with exceptions, but from quite a low base. But that's turning around now, and more resources are going in, more people are being employed. New agency, MARA, a brand new agency, involved with licensing and sea. Brand spanking new agency, very, very impressive. An impressive approach. Their approach is impressive. They're doing it right. You know what I mean? There's nothing of the old Foreshore Act from the 30s. Slapped at, bits and pieces added on. Oh, shrug, it's not my job. That's somebody else's job. Those days are over. We're taking it on head on now in a way we never had before. So I'll take that. I'll take a positive message from that. But the overarching message is we're under pressure. We have a lot to do. We're starting very late.
Stephen, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Lovely.
And before you go, since you stick to the end of this show, then first and foremost, thank you so much for listening and for watching. And if you enjoy what I do here, and I presume you do since you listen to the very end, you should subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. So get in there and you will get notifications not only about the latest episodes of the podcast, but also about everything else that is happening in the conservation and science world.